Nobody expected her to return. Then she walked back with the mission complete. The last time anyone in Clover Hill saw Amara Cole, she was leaving in a car that belonged to someone else, with a bag that was not fully zipped, and a look on her face that told people exactly what they wanted to believe: that she was done, that she had given up. The town had spent 3 years watching her fight for the community health center that the county government had quietly decided to close, and in the end, the government had won. The building was shut, the sign came down, the staff went home, and Amara drove away. That was the story people told. They told it over coffee in the diner on 5th Street. They told it at the school board meeting when someone mentioned her name and a few people smiled in the way that people smile when they feel confirmed. She had tried. She had failed. The world was not sentimental about failure, and Clover Hill was not an exception. What nobody mentioned, because nobody knew, was that Amara had made a phone call from a gas station 40 miles outside of town 3 hours after she left. She had called a woman named Dr. Patricia Owens, a public health researcher at a university 7 states away, and she had said 6 words. She had said, "I think I know how to fix this." Patricia had been quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me." That conversation lasted 4 hours. Amara sat in her car in a gas station parking lot as the sun went down. And she talked, and Patricia listened, and by the time it was over, something had been set in motion that would not stop for the next 4 years. But nobody in Clover Hill knew that. Nobody was watching. The last chapter, as far as the town was concerned, had already been written. Amara Cole was gone, and the health center was closed, and that was the end of it. Clover Hill was a small town in the way that most small towns are small, not in population alone, but in memory. The people there remembered things with a precision that felt almost personal. They remembered who had won the spelling bee in 1994. They remembered which families had stopped speaking to each other after a land dispute that nobody under 40 fully understood. They remembered every person who had come through with a plan to make things better, and had eventually left with that plan still unfinished. Amara had grown up knowing all of this. Her mother, Clara Cole, had worked as a nurse at the community health center for 19 years. The center had been the only place within 30 miles where families without private insurance could get consistent medical care. It was where children received their vaccinations. It was where elderly residents managed their medications. It was where new mothers went when they were afraid and did not know what to do. For Clara, it was not a job. It was the reason she got up in the morning. When Amara was 15, her mother came home one evening and sat at the kitchen table without taking off her coat. Amara remembered that detail with the kind of clarity that only comes when something is about to change. Clara had received a letter that afternoon. The county was reviewing the center's funding. The review, the letter said, was routine. Clara knew it was not. She had heard that phrase before. She had watched what happened after it. Amara sat across from her mother and watched her read the letter a second time, and then a third. She did not ask what it said. She already understood. There was something being threatened that her family could not afford to lose, and the people threatening it were not villains in the obvious sense. They were officials in offices who worked with spreadsheets and used words like restructuring and reallocation, and believed, sincerely, that the numbers told the full story. They did not live in Clover Hill. They had never sat in the waiting room of that center and watched an elderly man wait 3 hours for a prescription refill because the nearest alternative was an hour's drive away. They had not done the math on what an hour's drive costs a family that owns 1 car and has 3 jobs between them. Clara fought the first review. She organized the staff, gathered patient testimonials, and drove to the county seat 3 times in 1 month to testify before people who listened politely and then voted the way they had already decided to vote. The funding was reduced but not eliminated. Clara drove home and told Amara it was a partial victory. Amara nodded. She was 16 by then. She already understood that partial victories were how important things were slowly lost. By the time Amara was in her final year of secondary school, the center had survived 2 more reviews. Each time, Clara organized. Each time, something small was taken away. A staff position eliminated here. A service reduced there. The waiting room that had once held 30 patients now held 20. The hours were shorter. The equipment was older. The building itself seemed to be exhaling slowly, as though it too was tired. Amara left for university on a scholarship. She studied public policy. She called her mother every Sunday. Clara always said the center was fine. Amara always knew that fine was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. She graduated with distinction. She received 2 job offers from organizations in cities far from Clover Hill, both of them offering salaries that would have been unimaginable to her mother. She turned them both down. She came home. The people of Clover Hill did not fully know what to do with this. A young woman with a degree and 2 good offers, who chose to come back, was either very devoted or very foolish, and the town was not sure which. They were kind to her face. They were cautious behind her back. They watched and waited, the way small towns watch and wait, to see what the returned person would do with herself. What Amara did was go straight to work. She met with the center's director, a quiet man named Dr. Raymond Hall, who had been trying to keep the place running for 11 years, on a budget that shrank every cycle. She asked him to show her everything: the financials, the patient records, the service logs, the correspondence with the county. He showed her all of it. She took it home and read through it over 3 nights, and on the 4th morning she came back with a folder full of notes and told him she had identified 4 specific structural problems with the funding application that had been costing them leverage for years. Raymond looked at her notes. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Nobody has ever broken it down this way before." She said, "I know." That was the beginning of 3 years of work so relentless that the people who watched it from the outside could not decide whether to be inspired or exhausted on her behalf. Amara wrote grants. She rewrote the center's mission documentation. She built relationships with county officials that were not warm, exactly, but were real. She organized community meetings that started with 10 people and grew to 80. She was 23 years old, and she was fighting the way only people fight when the thing being threatened belongs to them personally, when it is not abstract, when the waiting room they are defending is the one their mother walked through every morning for 19 years. And then, at the end of the 3rd year, the county made its final decision. The health center would close, permanently. The building would be repurposed. The services would be, and the official document used this word carefully, redistributed to regional facilities an average of 34 miles away. Amara read the document alone in her apartment at 11 in the evening. She sat with it for a long time. She did not call her mother that night. She did not call anyone. She sat in the quiet and read the language of the decision over and over. And somewhere in that reading, something shifted. Not broke. Shifted. She was not finished. She was just going to have to do this differently. 2 days later, she packed a bag that was not fully zipped, got into a car that belonged to her friend Nina, and drove out of Clover Hill. The people who saw her leave understood what they saw. They had seen this before. They would say, with a kind of gentle certainty, that they had always expected it would end this way. They were wrong. They just didn't know it yet. 40 miles from Clover Hill, at a gas station with a broken light above the door that blinked twice before it finally stayed on, Amara Cole made the phone call that changed everything. She had found Patricia Owens 6 months earlier, during research she had done at 2 in the morning, on a night when she could not sleep. Patricia had published a study on rural healthcare access in low-income counties that was unlike anything Amara had read before. The study did not just document the problem, it modeled a solution. It proposed a specific, replicable structure for community-funded health centers that operated partially outside the traditional county approval process, using a combination of federal grants, nonprofit frameworks, and community equity funding. It was technical. It was dense. It was also, Amara had thought when she first read it, exactly what she needed. She had emailed Patricia that night. Patricia had responded in 48 hours. They had spoken once, briefly, and Amara had explained her situation. Patricia had said she was interested, but that the model required certain legal and structural groundwork that could take years to build correctly. Amara had said she understood. She had filed that conversation away and continued fighting the conventional battle, because she had not been ready to give up on the direct approach. Now she was ready. The phone call lasted 4 hours. By the end of it, Amara had a direction. Not a plan exactly, The plan would take months to develop, but a direction. Patricia would provide the academic and structural framework. Amara would provide the local knowledge and the ground-level organizing. The goal was not to reopen the Clover Hill Health Center under county authority. The goal was to build a new structure that the county could not close, because it would not depend on the county for its survival. What followed was 4 years that Amara has described, in the rare interviews she gave later, as the loneliest and most important years of her life. She moved to a rented room in a city 3 hours from Clover Hill, close enough to return when necessary, far enough to work without the weight of people watching her fail. She enrolled part-time in a graduate program in health policy that Patricia had recommended, not because she needed the degree, but because the program gave her access to a network of researchers, lawyers, and policy specialists who knew things she needed to know. She worked 2 jobs to pay for all of it. She worked mornings at a nonprofit that provided administrative support to small community organizations, which meant she was, every day, learning exactly the kind of operational knowledge that most people with her background had never had to develop. She worked evenings at a restaurant because the hours were flexible and the money was reliable, and she was not precious about what the work looked like to other people. She had stopped caring about appearances before she left Clover Hill. She cared about results. During the first year, she made 47 formal applications, grant applications, federal program inquiries, nonprofit registration documents, legal filings. 31 of them were rejected. 14 received no response. 2 were approved. The 2 approvals were small, but they were real. They were proof that the structure she was building had a legal identity that the world recognized. She put both approval letters in a folder and kept the folder on her desk where she could see it. The second year was harder. Patricia's university restructured its research department, and for 7 months, their collaboration slowed almost to a stop. Patricia was fighting for her own position, trying to protect her work from an administration that valued commercially applicable research and was not enthusiastic about rural public health models in towns that had no money. Amara watched this from a distance and felt something she later described as clarifying. The recognition that every person fighting for something necessary was also, always, fighting for the right to keep fighting. Nobody was operating from a position of security. Everyone was building the floor while standing on it. She used those 7 months to work on the legal architecture of the organization she was building. She had connected, through the graduate program, with a lawyer named George Hale who specialized in nonprofit health law and had agreed, in exchange for a reduced rate, to consult on her project. George was precise and unhurried, and had a habit of asking the same question in 4 different ways, until he was certain she understood the answer. She did not always like this. She came to depend on it. George helped her understand the specific framework she needed. A federally recognized community health organization that met the criteria for a particular federal health funding program that, under the right conditions, would make the center financially independent of county approval. The criteria were demanding. The documentation requirements were extensive. The application would take more than a year to complete properly. George told her all of this on their first meeting, and watched her carefully as he said it, and she watched him back, and he said, "Most people hear that and look for a shorter path." She said, "There isn't one." He nodded slowly and said, "Then let's start." In the 3rd year, she returned to Clover Hill for the first time. Not to stay, to gather. She met with former patients, former staff, and current residents, conducting interviews that were, on the surface, about their experiences with the closed health center, but were also, in practice, a detailed assessment of what the community needed now and what it would need in 5 years. She kept the interviews quiet. She did not hold public meetings. She did not announce herself. She was aware that her return would be interpreted as either a sign that she had recovered from her failure or a sign that she was still struggling with it, and she did not want either interpretation circulating. She wanted information, not attention. Her mother, Clara, was the only person she told the full truth to. They sat in the kitchen, in the same 2 chairs where they had sat when Clara read the first review letter, and Amara laid out everything. The structure, the legal work, the timeline, the funding pathway. Clara listened without interruption. When Amara was finished, Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You've been doing this the whole time." Amara said yes. Clara looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she said, "Then stop visiting and get back to work." Amara drove back the next morning. The fourth year was the year the work became visible to people outside the small circle of those directly involved. Not visible to Clover Hill, not yet. Visible to the federal agency reviewing their application. An agency contact reached out to George with a set of clarifying questions that, George told Amara, were the kind of questions asked when reviewers were seriously engaged with an application. They were not easy questions. They were precise and probing and required detailed responses. Amara and George spent 3 weeks preparing the response document. It was 41 pages. During those 3 weeks, Amara slept an average of 5 hours a night. She ate at her desk. She called Patricia every other evening to review specific points. She developed a habit, late at night when she was too tired to write, but not tired enough to sleep, of reading the original study that had led her to Patricia in the first place. Not for information. She knew the study nearly from memory by now. For something else. For the reminder that the problem she was solving had been clearly seen by someone, documented with care, and answered with rigor. The answer existed. She was building toward it. The response document went in on a Thursday in October. Amara sent it, closed her laptop, put on her coat, and walked outside. It was cold. She stood on the pavement outside her apartment building and breathed the cold air, and did not think about anything in particular. She had done everything she could do for that specific task. The next step belonged to someone else's desk. She went back inside and made a list of the 17 things she still needed to complete before the application could be considered whole. She started on the first one the next morning. The approval did not come for another 8 months. In those 8 months, there were 2 more rounds of follow-up questions, 1 additional legal filing that George had anticipated and prepared her for, and 1 period of 3 weeks, during which the application portal showed a status that neither Amara nor George could interpret with confidence, and that they eventually concluded meant the review was ongoing. Amara did not check the portal more than once a day. She had decided this early on, and she kept to it, because she had learned that the work of waiting was its own kind of discipline, and that people who could not manage the waiting often undid good work with the anxiety of it. She managed the waiting by working on the next phase, the facility, the staffing model, the community engagement plan for when, not if, the application was approved. She wrote a full operational draft of the center's first year. She wrote a staffing plan that included 12 positions, with salary ranges, responsibilities, and a hiring timeline. She identified 3 potential locations in or near Clover Hill. She ranked them by cost, accessibility, and structural condition, and she wrote a single paragraph on each, explaining her reasoning. She had never stopped believing this would work. Not from confidence exactly. From something more durable. From the knowledge that the work was correct, that the need was real, that she had built the answer the right way, without shortcuts, without assumptions, without hoping that something outside her control would close the gap her own work had not yet closed. She had not hoped her way to this point. She had worked her way to it. And then, on a Wednesday afternoon, with nothing special about the day, George called. The application had been approved. George's voice on the phone was steady, the way it always was, but Amara had been speaking with him long enough to hear the thing underneath the steadiness. She sat down on her kitchen chair. She held the phone with both hands, which she was not aware of doing until after the call ended. George read her the key language from the approval. He explained what the next steps were, and what the timeline would look like, and what she would need to sign, and when. She listened to all of it. She asked 2 questions. He answered both. Then he said, "You built something real, Amara. Very few people would have stayed with this." She said thank you. She meant it in a way that was difficult to fully express in 2 words, and she did not try to expand on it. After the call, she sat in her kitchen for a while, without doing anything in particular. The approval was real. The 4 years of work had produced the thing they were supposed to produce. The organization was legally recognized, federally funded, and structurally independent in exactly the way she and Patricia and George had designed it to be. It could not be closed by the county because it did not depend on the county. It existed on its own legal and financial foundations. It was, In the language of the documents she had spent 4 years building, a community health organization with federally qualified health center designation, serving a rural underserved population in a defined geographic area. In the language of her own life, it was the thing she had promised herself she would build when she drove out of Clover Hill with a bag that was not fully zipped. She called Patricia. Patricia said, "I knew this would happen. I did not know when, but I knew." They talked for an hour, not about logistics but about what it meant, and what came next, and what they had learned that they would do differently next time. Because there would be a next time. Because the problem did not stop at Clover Hill's border. She called her mother last. Not because Clara was the least important, but because Amara needed to have processed the news enough to deliver it without her voice doing something she could not control. Clara picked up on the second ring. Amara said, "Mom, it's done." Clara was quiet. Amara heard her exhale. Then Clara said, "When do we start?" Amara smiled in the way that people smile when the thing they have been working toward is no longer a future event, but a present fact. She said, "We already have." The following weeks were not a celebration. They were the beginning of the next phase of work, which was in some ways harder than the application phase, because now the work was concrete. The facility had to be found, leased, and prepared. Staff had to be recruited and vetted. Community engagement had to begin in a deliberate way. The first operational meeting included Amara, Patricia on video, George on the phone, and 3 people Amara had identified during her quiet return visit to Clover Hill: a former health center nurse named Donna Bright, a community organizer named Felix Grant, and a retired pharmacist named William Park, who had spent the years since the center closed driving elderly residents to the regional facility 34 miles away, and had kept a detailed record of every trip, every patient, every condition that had been managed less effectively because of the distance. William brought his records to that first meeting in a folder held together with 2 rubber bands. He put it on the table and said, "This is 4 years of what the absence cost." Nobody needed to read the folder to understand what it meant. Its weight on the table was enough. The facility they chose was a former community hall on the edge of Clover Hill's main district, a wide, low building that had good bones and needed significant interior work. Amara negotiated a lease that gave them 18 months to reach operational status. The federal funding covered the build-out. The operational budget was structured for a 5-year runway with annual reporting requirements that Amara had already written the framework for, because she had learned, over 4 years, that the work of keeping something alive was not separate from the work of building it. They were the same work. She moved back to Clover Hill 3 weeks after the approval. She rented a small apartment 2 streets from her mother's house. She did not announce her return. She did not call the local newspaper. She started showing up to work at the building site every morning at 7 and leaving when the light was gone. The people of Clover Hill began to notice her, the way towns notice things that happen gradually, and then all at once. They saw the van parked outside the old community hall. They saw the lights on inside at hours when buildings in that part of town were usually dark. They saw Amara on the pavement, talking to contractors, reviewing plans, walking the perimeter of the building with a measuring tape and a notebook. Some of them stopped to ask what was happening. She told them. She said a community health center was being built, that it would be open to all residents regardless of insurance status, that it would offer primary care, pediatric services, pharmacy access, and mental health support, and that it would be fully operational within the year. She said this the way someone says something that is already true, because to her it was. The reactions varied. Some people were immediately glad. Some people were cautious, because they had been glad before and it had not ended well, and they had learned to protect themselves from hope. Some people said nothing, and went home, and came back the next day to look at the building again, as though the building itself needed to earn their belief before they gave it. Amara did not ask anyone to believe anything. She kept showing up and doing the work, and the work kept producing evidence, and the evidence was more persuasive than anything she could have said. The morning Amara walked back into the county administrative building for the first time since the night she had read the closure decision in her apartment, she was carrying a folder. The folder contained a single document, a formal notification of operational status. required by the federal program, which had to be delivered to the county health authority as a matter of record. It was not a request. It was not an appeal. It was a notification. She did not need their permission. She was informing them of a fact. She had not been in that building in more than 4 years. The lobby had a new floor and the same front desk and a security guard she did not recognize. She signed in, was given a visitor badge, and took the elevator to the 4th floor, where the county health office was located. She sat in a waiting room chair for 11 minutes, before a woman named Louise Crane came out to meet her. Louise was the deputy director of county health services, and she had been involved, at the mid-level, in the original decision to close the Clover Hill Center. Amara knew this. Louise, looking at Amara with an expression that was carefully neutral, clearly knew that Amara knew. Amara handed her the document. She said, "The Clover Hill Community Health Center will begin operations on the 1st of next month. This is the formal notification required under the federal program. You will receive a copy of the annual reporting schedule by end of week." Louise took the document. She looked at it for a moment. She said, "I see." Amara said, "I wanted to deliver it in person." Louise said, "I appreciate that." There was a pause. Then Louise looked up from the document and said, "This is the independent model, the qualified health center designation." Amara said, "Yes." Louise said, "That's a significant process. That takes years." Amara said, "It took 4." Louise looked at her, and for a moment the careful neutrality in her expression gave way to something more honest. She said, "You did this on your own?" Amara said, "I had good people." Louise nodded slowly. She said, "We'll be in touch regarding the reporting schedule." Amara thanked her, picked up her bag and left. She did not feel triumphant walking out of that building. She felt, if anything, like someone who had just completed a very long errand. The notification had been delivered. The county was informed. The building in Clover Hill was being prepared. The staff had been hired. The patients would arrive in 32 days. The thing that needed to be done had been done. Everything after this was continuation, not conclusion. The opening of the center was, by the deliberate design of everyone involved, not a ceremony. Amara had been offered the option of a ribbon-cutting event, a local press release, an invitation to county officials. She had declined all of it. She had said, and she had meant it, that the opening of the center was for the people who needed it, not for the people who had built it. The patients did not need a ribbon. They needed a door that was open. On the first morning, Donna Bright unlocked that door at 8 o'clock. There were 9 patients already waiting outside. By noon, there were 23. By the end of the first week, the schedule was full for the following month. William Park's records, which had spent 4 years in a folder with 2 rubber bands, became the baseline data for a report on healthcare access outcomes that Amara and Patricia co-authored and submitted to a public health journal 8 months later. The report was cited 14 times in its first year of publication. Clara Cole came to the center on the second day. Not as a patient. She had spoken with Donna the week before and had offered, in a quiet and matter-of-fact way, to volunteer on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, helping with patient intake and administrative support. Donna had said yes. Clara arrived at 8, put her things in the small office at the back, and sat down at the intake desk. She had not worked in a health center in 4 years. She had her mother's efficiency and her own long institutional memory, and within an hour, she had reorganized the intake process in a way that cut average wait time by 8 minutes. She said nothing about this to anyone. She simply did it. Amara watched her from across the room at one point that morning and felt something that was not easy to name. Her mother was at a desk in a building that existed because Amara had refused to accept the building's absence. The distance between those two facts, the closed center and the open one, was 4 years of work that had been done without applause, without validation, without a single moment where anyone in authority had told her she was on the right path. She had built the path. The path had gone somewhere real. She did not stand in the doorway long. There was work to do. The thing about Amara Cole that the people of Clover Hill would come to understand slowly, over the years that followed, was that she had not returned to show them anything. She had not returned to demonstrate that she had been right and they had been wrong. She had not returned to accept the revision of the story they had told about her. The story they told had never been her concern. Her concern had been the 34-mile drive that elderly residents were making for prescriptions. Her concern had been the children in that county whose vaccinations had been falling behind the national average since the center closed. Her concern had been the thing that was missing, and the people who needed it. She had gone away to build the answer. She had come back with it. And now, every morning, the door was open. Felix Grant, the community organizer who had joined the project in its final year, said something in a staff meeting 6 months after opening that stayed with everyone in the room. He said, "Most people who leave and come back want to be seen coming back." She came back like she had never left, like the leaving was just part of getting here. Nobody disagreed with this. George Hale visited the center once, 8 months after it opened, while he was passing through for a conference. He walked through the building with Amara and asked her questions about the operational setup and listened to her answers with the same careful attention he had given to every document they had worked on together. At the end of the visit, standing in the small parking area outside, he said, "I've worked on a lot of these applications. I've never seen one built from the outside in, starting with the community need and building the legal structure around it. Most people do it the other way. They find the framework and then find the community to fit it." Amara said, "The framework exists to serve the community. It goes in that order." George said, "Yes." He paused. "It's not the easy order." She said, "No." He drove away. She went back inside. In the second year, the center expanded its mental health services, adding a part-time counselor 2 days per week. In the third year, a second location opened in a neighboring county. In the fourth year, the model Amara and Patricia had developed was formally documented in a policy framework that Patricia's university published and distributed to health policy departments in 11 states. Amara was still in Clover Hill when all of this happened. She was not speaking on conference stages, though she received invitations. She was not pursuing a political appointment, though someone suggested one. She was at the center, on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, sitting at the intake desk next to her mother, because those mornings were the part of the work that was most real to her, the part where the building's purpose was most visible, where the reason she had spent 4 years in a rented room in a city 3 hours away was sitting in the waiting room chairs and coming up to the desk and asking for help, and receiving it. The story of Amara Cole did not have the shape that stories are usually given. There was no single moment where the world turned and the light changed, and the right people saw what she had done and said the right things. There was, instead, a door, an open door, at 8 o'clock every morning, in a building that had not existed 4 years earlier, in a town that had stopped expecting her to come back. She had come back anyway. She had not come back with a speech or a performance or a desire to rewrite the story people had told about her. She had come back with the work in her hands, complete, real, and functioning. She put it down on the table. She sat down. She got back to work.